Welcome to Virginia's Academical podcast, featuring Matt Trevett-Smith and Stacy Williams-Duncan. This week's topics. How can we best prepare our students to give useful feedback on evaluations of teaching? When your student says they couldn't turn in that assignment because their hard drive crashed, are they lying to you? What can you get in a residential college that you can't get online? And are today's college students really cheating more than they did 50 years ago? Welcome back, Stacy, to Virginia's Academical podcast. We're recording from the Chandler Memorial Audio Studio, deep in the bowels of UVA's Robertson Media Center. I wanted to announce real quick that we actually have an email address. It's academicalpodcast@virginia.edu. So if folks want to get involved in the conversation, send us some ideas, or even be a guest in the future, they can send us an email. And that email is academicalpodcast@virginia.edu, and it's listed at our website and the TRC blog as well. I thought I'd start with a quick comment. Now that we are the number one podcast on teaching and learning ever recorded in the studio, I've been reading the Virginia Magazine, which is actually put out by the UVA Alumni Association. And if you look at it, one of my favorite parts is to look at the houses that are for sale. and most of the great thing about it is all these houses are way out of my price range, $3, $4, $5, $15 million. But now that we're the number one podcast on teaching and learning ever recorded in the studio, I thought that I could start looking at some of these. And another thing that I really thought was interesting is that I didn't know, do you use Reddit at all?
Yeah, I've just started using Reddit some.
There's a connection, UVA and Reddit.
I didn't know that.
I'm trying to flip through. The co-founders of Reddit are actually UVA students, graduated in 2005. Both of them. Oh, here it is right here. See, the voice of his generation right there. There he is. So that's kind of neat. I thought that there was a connection right there. I go to it quite frequently, so I thought that was cool. So it's really more cool than just dream shopping for houses.
It would be the alums such as those that found Reddit that could afford those houses, not general faculty members.
No, well, we can mention it.
We can dream,
just
though.
Kind of say this podcast is so. And I did say it was the number one podcast on teaching and learning ever recorded in the studio. So the money is just going to start rolling in now. Okay, so this is in the beginning. We try and talk about what different conversations we're seeing that are going on out there in listservs, emails, or private conversations, something that you like to talk about that maybe you don't get a chance to. I don't know. Did you want to start or do you want me to start? Doesn't matter.
You start.
All right. I'll start. Thank you. Something that's been in my mind now that we're in the teaching analysis poll season, we're kind of in that mid-semester time. It's weird to think about because we just started, but it's already the end of September. So we're starting to get requests for teaching analysis polls, and I think a lot of teaching resource centers do something similar. So the idea is that you come in and you either do some type of focus group or a student evaluation of teaching somewhere about now and halfway between the semester, asking them basically what's going right, what's not going so great, and any suggestions that they might have going forward. And I think it's interesting. We have a lot of comments come up for these evaluations where things are seemingly going very well. Instructor is very engaging, writes clear notes, things like that. But then we'll get some negative comments that say, man, there's just too much content. I really wish we could slow down, or this class should be offered more than twice a week. It should be offered 3 or 4 times a week. But oftentimes those are held as just little things that should be corrected. And I think that's really more the big things that should be corrected, right? I think that's more of a symptom of an underlying problem of the way the course is designed. Specifically saying, well, there's just too much content. We need 75 minutes instead of a 50-minute class, or we need 4 days instead of 2 days a week. And the students say it quite enthusiastically. So they like the instructor, right? They like the way that it's being delivered, and they wouldn't mind spending an extra 2 hours a week with that instructor. But I think they're touching on something that is an underlying cause of course design, and that the instructor is attempting to focus too much on content and not enough on the activities that are happening in the class and the student learning.
I think that's a huge challenge. I mean, when I think about all of the instructors, or at least the vast majority of instructors, and especially full professors who did their graduate work in a time in which if you didn't have a fair amount of content and memorized material in your head, then you didn't have ready access to it. Even if you were on a great university campus, you might have to go to the library, or you might have to go to someplace else to access that information. And so there was really a necessity to become an expert in your field, that you hold on to a lot of content. And I think we definitely clearly are moving into an environment in which that's not the case, and content is much more readily available. The challenge is to know where that fine line is, because there's still some content, some foundational knowledge that you have to have access to in order to be successful in your field. But there's other content that you can look up every time you need it. And I think it's a really hard discernment on the part of a faculty member to figure out where that line is, and to figure out where that line is for our students,
Right.
not for us.
Yeah. What brought this thought on an email that Nick Carbone sent out on the pod listserv recently, which was actually a link to his blog. And so I wanted to share a little bit of it. It's ncarbone.blogspot.com. And the title of this blog was Suggestions for Teaching College Students How to Write a Teaching Evaluation. But I think Nick really raises an interesting point, that are we doing all that we should or could be to prepare our students to write useful evaluations of teaching? And he has he has 4 different points. The first is the show, don't tell, right? That general rule. So rather, for example, of saying, well, the instructor was lazy, try and pull that apart and say, well, why do you think the instructor was lazy? So for example, I would turn in an assignment and the instructor had in the syllabus that within 3 days they would give me feedback so that I could then incorporate it into the next assignment that was due a week later. But the instructor didn't provide me with that feedback until 5 days later. So they're interpreting that as being lazy, whereas what they're really trying to get is it's a time management type of thing.
You know, one of the things we talk about a lot is getting students to do their own self-evaluation and metacognitive feedback and sort of reflection about how they're learning. And I'm almost wondering whether you could turn his idea on its head and have the students do intentional, well-written evaluations of themselves, give them feedback on that, and then say, that's the same format I want you to take when you give feedback on the class.
The last was, I think this is a good one, is describe strengths that worked as well. So to not just focus on the negative, but to also focus on the positive.
That's one of the things that greatly distinguishes the mid-semester TAPs we do from the end of the semester evaluations, is that one of the realities of end of the semester evaluations that are anonymous and that are done through big survey functions on our learning management system is that you can get students who are outliers. A few, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 students can be really upset with the course, and when a faculty member gets that evaluation back, those are the comments they focus on and they obsess about. I've seen lots of faculty do this, where when we do a mid-semester TAP and it's personally facilitated by one of our faculty developers, we're able to really look at what's the consensus in the class. And you may still have a few outliers, but the person facilitating it is able to identify those and really discern for the faculty member what are the things that are worth shifting because they'll matter to a large enough number of students, and what are the things that really might be about that student and not about anything you're doing. Also, just throw this out there. I know education folks, we can be a little obsessive about reliability and validity, but and have the evaluations been tested? And I'm not saying that we should hold course evaluations to the level of reliability and validity that we hold other kinds of high-stakes tests, but it is interesting to me to think about how did these evaluations, especially the end-of-the-course ones that are high stakes for professors who are in tenure-track settings, how did they get developed? Did we do feedback to figure out, are the students even reading the question the way the faculty member is or the provost is? In some ways, I think that because course evaluations have become high stakes for faculty members, they should be treated a little bit more like other high stakes tests.
Yeah, and I think they often are prone to the prejudices that we as instructors bring to them as well, right? And we can be very easy to dismiss the tool in and of itself, especially if we get a particularly potent negative comment or a collection of negative comments. We can say, well, they just didn't understand, or they weren't really motivated, or this is just the students who didn't do well.
Right.
And a lot of times that could impact our discussions about them as instructors and evaluators. There's a really great idea paper, I think it's idea paper number 50, that really discusses as a kind of meta study this idea of student evaluations and what they're measuring and why and all that type of stuff. I thought it's a really good one. I'm pretty sure it's number 50.
I think it is.
Okay. So what are you reading? What are you talking about? What are you thinking about?
Well, it's interesting because I think that a piece of this about evaluation and feedback ties back into our ongoing conversation about student motivation that we tend to have. And one of the things I've been thinking about since our last class in teaching, learning, and higher ed is that we talked a lot about the value expectancy theory of student motivation, and which is the idea that if you increase a student's expectation that they will perform well and you increase how much they value the content in the class, then their motivation will go up. And I think that there is often a confusion. I heard this both in class and I've had a second conversation with another faculty member about it. There's a confusion between increasing someone's expectation for success and rigor. And some people think that we have to make assessments less rigorous in order to make students expect success. But it's really important that in that motivational theory we understand that it's not whether students succeed or not, it's whether they expect to be able to. So if they give it their all, do they think they have enough information, and do they think they've been taught the skills that they need to succeed? And most of the time, even when students don't do well on an assessment, but they had a high expectation of success, their motivation will still continue. And you really set up this long-term approach to learning that is about learning in and of itself and not just about the grade.
Yeah, and I think when you take this into consideration when you're designing a course or you're designing an assessment, you can oftentimes be even more rigorous, right? Because you've got that idea of student motivation. What can I do to keep the students motivated, or what can I do to keep the students involved? Or how can I prepare them to not only expect to do well, but to actually do well? And that's what one of the most freeing parts of me as a teacher is that I can be very rigorous, right? I can be very strict or difficult as long as all along the way you're preparing the students to succeed, one, so that they can, but two, so that they feel as though they can, right? It's very important. I think that's very useful. What happens then if the student gets to, let's say, a rigorous assignment, and it's due Friday, they get to it Thursday, and they start looking at it and they say, oh, no. There's no way I'm going to be able to complete this by tomorrow. This is way more assignment than I thought it was going to be. I need to put in more research time. I need to put in more time to write. It's just not going to happen. There was an interesting paper that was come out of active learning in higher education that it's called An Examination of Factors and Attitudes that Influence Reporting Fraudulent Claims in an Academic Environment. So the idea was actually really neat. So the setup here was that, all right, they got a focus group of about 320-odd students.
That's a lot of students.
That's a lot of students. They divided them into a couple different groups, and they said, all right, this is the scenario that I just mentioned. The paper is due Friday. It's Thursday. The paper is worth, in the different groups, one group said 5%, the other group said 20% of the final grade. Turns out that didn't matter at all. So now you have a decision to make. Do you lie to the instructor and say, oh, I'm sick, there was a family emergency, my computer hard drive crashed? Or do you go to the instructor and say, look, instructor, I didn't plan this out very well. This assignment is harder than I thought it was going to be. Can I please get an extension?
I've done that before.
You're not alone. I was talking, Abby, our undergraduate student assistant in the TRC. I was just reading this article, and she kind of saw me wandering around the TRC in this fog as I was thinking about it. She's like, what are you doing? And so I ran this scenario through her, and she said the same thing, that she has asked for the extension. I don't know if I probably have asked for an extension. I remember the first time I realized that lying could get me out of an assignment. I think it was in 5th grade. I went into class and I didn't have my homework done for whatever reason. I can't remember. I was playing with my Hot Wheels or something. I don't know. And I didn't have it. And I know I lied. I can't remember what I said. Dog ate it. I was probably not very creative. And the instructor said, that's okay, Matt. This is the first assignment you've missed the deadline for. Just turn it in tomorrow. And for me as a small child, I was like, wait a minute. I was just rewarded for doing the bad thing. If a student came to you and said the assignment was more than they thought it was going to be, and they asked you, Instructor Williams-Duncan, for an extension, What would you say?
I have to be honest, I tend to be pretty liberal with extensions as long as students come to me. So even if you come to me 24 hours in advance and say, this is what's happened, may I have an extension? My response usually is, yes, and can we spend 5 minutes talking about what your plan is? So I want to make sure I just don't dole it out without a conversation, but I actually am pretty liberal and lenient about extensions. That being said, there are times in which I'm not going to give extensions, and I'm really clear about that up front. So like the last paper of the semester, I taught a class, I TA'd for a class 2 years ago in which we had the last exam section. And so I only had 48 hours to turn around grades. And I was really clear, you have to get those papers in on time. This is when it's due because I don't have any turnaround time. So that's what I tend to do. I also tend to listen really closely if they come to me with some other excuse.
I think I'm the same way. When someone comes to me and asks for an extension, I generally ask them to check in writing. Saying, all right, that's fine. Just tell me where you are right now. If you're at an outline stage, give me an outline. If you're just on a rough thought, just give me a paragraph that is in no way organized. Just turn that in as a check, and then we'll say I'll more often than not give you an extension.
That's a great idea. I'm going to steal that one.
On the flip side of that, if an instructor comes to you and says, my hard drive crashed, I need more time, what would you do in that situation?
I would say, I find it really interesting that you're still working on a hard drive and not in the cloud. So that would be my first suggestion.
Have you heard of this Google?
Well, I mean, Google or Dropbox or at UVA, you get free UVA box. There are lots of places to work in the cloud. And so once again, I would ask them, so what have you done to handle this? I mean, have you taken it to Cavalier Computers? So I would push a little bit to see what steps they'd already taken.
Yeah.
And then it would probably depend on how reliable they'd been. I mean, unfortunately, I'd be a little bit like your fifth grade teacher. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in most cases, in that situation, I'm less rigorous than if someone came to me and asked for an extension. A computer crash doesn't happen all that often. I don't get that excuse, but I got the flu or whatever. I think that happens a little more often. I was sick, something like that. I generally don't ask for whatever reason. I generally don't ask for them to check in. Maybe it's because if they generally were sick, they wouldn't even have time to write an outline or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of interesting. I'm thinking back to myself, man, I'm tougher on the student who's telling me the truth than one that's potentially lying, or am I just assuming they're all telling me the truth?
I think knowing you're assuming they're all telling you the truth.
That's probably true. Not anymore now that I have this study that I've read. So the grand reveal, only 39% would tell the truth.
Wow.
Only 39% would tell the truth. That's just only slightly over a third of the students. But what's interesting is that even those students who did or said they would tell the truth, only half of those expected to actually get an extension out of it. Whereas nearly 100% of the students who would lie would expect an extension out of it.
Wow, so there's this whole piece about I might not even deserve it. Wow, that's fascinating. So, Matt, can I just jump in on a little bit broader topic about cheating and lying? So I've been reading a little bit about cheating, too. Not because I have any concerns about it, but because I got asked about it by a faculty member. And I found some research. There are a couple of books that have come out in the last few years. But in one of these books, I found out that the first major survey on cheating rates in America's colleges and universities was conducted in 1963 by Bowers when he was a doctoral student at Columbia. Now, the interesting thing is that he asked this relatively large group, 5,000 students, so a lot of students, and 75% of them admitted to cheating at least once during their college careers. So we have this baseline in 63. We talk a lot about how cheating's increased, or at least it seems like every generation of instructors say that their current students, which are in the next generation, cheat more. But interestingly enough, McCaig at Rutgers University did a repeat of this study. And they did it over an 8-year period from 2002 to 2010. And all these statistics are reported in his book called Cheating in College. But in his studies, he found that the cheating rates actually had dropped slightly, that only 60 to 70%, depending on which year, reported having cheated. So it's sort of interesting to think about the fact that I think realistically you could say that cheating at the university level is probably held steady, but with those percentages. But I think it's just fascinating to think about what are the perceptions as instructors of our students versus what are the perceptions of our peers from when we were in college. And it makes me think over and over and over, every time I'm in a faculty development training setting, I remind faculty members that we're not designing courses for faculty members because they were the top percentage of their classes.
Exactly.
They were successful at school. They were passionate about learning. Look, they went on and did a PhD. They were not the students who needed to be motivated. We're designing courses for the other students.
Right.
And I think that's a really hard perspective, or at least it's a hard perspective for me, to remind myself that I am not designing a course for someone with my academic motivation.
This question comes up quite a bit, especially when you're talking about distance education and assessment. How do you account for cheating? And a lot of times the answers are kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I've heard it enough times that maybe the cheek is a little bloody, but I've heard it enough times to say, well, you're creating the wrong type of assessments.
That's right.
If your assessments are that easy to cheat off of or to cheat for, then you're creating the wrong type of assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that assessment look like? And we get into this quite a bit in regards to course design and really aligning your assessments up and really personalizing it. If you create that learning-centered classroom, then it's not so much about just regurgitating the content, where I think it's easier to plagiarize, for example, that type of process. I had one instructor in graduate school, Robert Knox Denton III.
Wow, that's a name.
He went by Bob. But one of the most impactful instructors I had during my graduate career, and I only ever took one class with him, his class was very formative for me in that we were reading a number of different authors within anthropology, so Margaret Mead, Franz Boas, Milanauskas, all these authors. And then he would ask us to write a one-page summary of whatever we had just read, adopting the style of the author we just read.
Well, that'd be a challenge.
It was very challenging, talking about rigor, right? It was very challenging to do, but it allowed me to experiment with a number of different voices, a number of different data sets, whether I wanted to be qualitative or quantitative heavy. It was very interesting. So that kind of is another way thinking about creating assessments that cannot be cheated on. Right. The idea was to personalize that particular message and do your best. But another quote that he had that has always stuck with me was the his brain is like a clogged toilet. Have I ever told you that analogy?
No, that's...
So the idea, I know it's kind of graphic, but the idea was all of his knowledge is in his head. Okay. And it just kind of floats around. Sometimes it sinks. Sometimes it comes back up to the surface. And like a clogged toilet, you got to jiggle the handle occasionally to get what you want.
Well, Matt, you are so right on track. The second book on cheating that I looked at is called Cheating Lessons by James Lang. And his whole goal is to create a classroom in which no cheating can happen. And so he does that by looking at academic dishonesty in America. But he comes down to the exact same place you did, is it's all about course design, and it's about creating assessments that really require students to engage. And so I think that that's an important piece to consistently talk about. And, he talks about the reasons students cheat and how we can address all of those in our designs. Students tend to cheat because they don't expect to perform well. We've already talked about that, because there's a high-stakes assessment. So how much is that exam worth percentage-wise in the grade? There's some kind of external force pressuring them. And they have, once again, we come back to expectation again, this low expectation of success. And so Lang is coming at this the same way you are, which is to say, if we don't want students to cheat, maybe the onus is on us. To some extent. I'm not saying I'm going to dismiss all academic dishonesty, but maybe a little bit of the problem is us and how we've designed courses. It's one thing to have good intentions, and it's one thing to really say, I believe in a learner-centered environment. I believe in having performance assessments. I believe in formative feedback. But it's a whole nother thing to take the extra step and to actually do that in your classroom, because it just takes a lot of time. And so I think that's a piece that I'm constantly thinking about.
That's interesting because I think that's a philosophy that we have or an assumption that we're making, especially, and we're not alone in that in the Course Design Institute. I'd say it's the same in any course design institute
Absolutely.
that's out there. What kind of evidence do we have that this intensive time that we spent designing this course is actually being performed? Right. So you create this very learner-centered document that's very well thought out, very much an integrated course design, and then that instructor goes off and starts teaching it. How do you know that they're doing what they're saying they're doing?
That's right.
And I think that's one thing that we're working on kind of in-house here at the TRC is understanding the relationship between the design and the actual implementation, and we're partnering with Castle Higher Ed as one particular example. And I think that's very important. And another, I think, an important factor that Michael Palmer, our colleague in the TRC, is working on as well is the student perception of the learner-centered syllabus and the learner-centered course, right? So if you've got this very learner-centered syllabus, how are students interpreting that? So I think that's all still to come, but I think that's the next step.
So the other thing that I have just recently done, which I have never done before in my academic experience, is done a portfolio as a final assessment, a final assignment. So I think I mentioned last time that I was working on the professional certificate in online education through the University of Wisconsin, and I finished the last assignment for that, and that's all done. Hopefully I'll get my certificate within 2 weeks. But my last assignment was to take a whole bunch of assignments that I'd done along the way and to edit and refine them and put them together into an online portfolio that would represent an online course design. And it was just a fascinating experience because, one, I'd never worked with a portfolio before. I've talked about it. I've even assigned one before, but I've never actually done it.
Yeah.
So I learned some things about how I will change my directions for students next time, particularly being explicit about the fact that I don't just expect them to cut and paste things, but I really expect them to refine, that there's a refinement step. I appreciated that my instructor told us that and said this is the expectation. But it was also really cool because every time I was working on this, I found myself thinking, oh, it's okay to spend an extra 30 minutes doing this because I'm going to use it later. And so I really also have begun to think about when we do these kinds of authentic assessments and performance assessments, when we ask students to invest a lot of time, are we being conscious of how they might use them later on? That's an experience I had in the last 2 weeks that I thought, oh, this is going to influence how I move forward with using this kind of assignment.
To stretch that connection segue from an online portfolio to a project that I'm working on regarding José Bowen. I'm leading a reading group based on the book. So I'm actually reading the book for the first time.
Wow.
You'd think that this is something that is near and dear to my heart, that I would have read it originally when it came out, but I didn't. I think some of it was misconceptions, particularly of the title. I thought, without reading, it was just poor judgment on my part, that he was arguing that there is no place for technology in classes, period.
You're in good company. I wondered that too when I first looked at it.
But that's not the case at all.
Not
He's
at all.
arguing that technology should be leveraged to its utmost outside of the classroom so that you can really engage in some active learning strategies within the physical classroom itself. But one of the things that I found was particularly interesting was his take on education in this new global marketplace. Mm-hmm. His idea of where is higher education going, where is it right now? And he had these 4 models for higher education that I just wanted to share because I think that it's really interesting. And one is the first is the free model, the Khan Academies that are out there, the MOOCs that are out there, any of these free courses that you can get. The idea that knowledge is no longer confined by university walls. Right? Knowledge is out there. So there's this free model. The second model is the elite university model. Mm-hmm. What students expect to get out of it is not necessarily knowledge or learning, but is instead the networking and the brand. And his argument there is that that's not going anywhere. Right? Those universities will not go away. And then the vast majority of colleges and universities, he's arguing, does not fit into those, but it will likely change. That's traditional models that are oftentimes residential, and they have the strongest potential for using technology outside of the classrooms. What can you get out of that experience that is not focused around knowledge?
Oh my gosh. This is exactly what we've been talking about in the college student development class that I'm taking. And one of the big debates in college student development is this idea of, do we teach these other developmental skills? Is that part of our curriculum, or is the curriculum just what's happening in class? The fascinating thing is, I read a series of studies for that class last week that say that students who actually don't attend college take longer to move through those early adulthood developmental stages because they're not being exposed to as much diversity of thought and being pushed to develop in some of these particular ways. So I personally think that residential colleges, much of why I respect what UVA is doing in its strategic plan, is to look holistically about what happens in the classroom and what's happening in the advising environment and what's happening in the entire grounds experience. And I think that's what is education. May not be just academics, but it's that whole picture. And I think that's the real value that's going to always be valuable, I think.
I had a colleague at another institution who would argue with his last breath that the residential college was going away. He was a big fan of the for-profit model.
Right.
He thought that was the future of higher education, especially in leveraging technologies. But I'm with you. I think there's really something special that can and often does happen in a residential university. That idea of the forming connections, the conversations that can happen, and also the practice in applying the content, right? So I think at universities, if we can free ourselves from this idea that we are the bearers of knowledge, that we are the bearers of content, to one of networking knowledge with students and with actions and ability, I think that's where the strongest potential is.
And of course, people may be surprised to hear the two of us, people that have spent so much of our energy focusing on integrating educational technology into courses, say this. But I think that it's so important to recognize that we leverage our time and we get more out of our class time if we take full advantage of what educational technology brings to the table. And I personally am a huge fan of hybrid courses or technology-enhanced courses because we get the best of what happens in some of those online and learning environments and the best of what happens in face-to-face or residential traditional classrooms. And if we bring the best of both of those to bear on our course design, then what is possible is just everything.
We'll end there. I think that's an excellent point to end. I want to remind folks once again that if you'd like to get involved in the conversation, we have a brand new email address, academicalpodcast@virginia.edu, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you.
That will do it for our conversation this week. On behalf of everyone here at Virginia's Academical Podcast, I'm Matt Trevett-Smith saying have a great day, and we hope you'll join us again next week.